Hello, I'm Roger Sheley, rangeland weed ecologist with the Agricultural Research Service at Eastern Oregon Agricultural Research Center, and I'm here to present an Eastern Oregon Ag Minute. All too often I hear that livestock are the blame for weeds, but ARS research shows that livestock can actually be a major factor in managing weeds on rangelands. We have work that shows livestock can be used to keep vegetation vigorous and strong, and these plants are very competitive against weeds. And we have studies that demonstrate how grazing management, that is proper intensity, frequency, and season of grazing, can shift plant dominance from weeds to native or desired species. Of all the weed management tools, grazing may be the most practical and cost-effective. So this week we'll talk about grazing as a tool in weed management. A few years ago I was trying to understand how grazing affected weed invasion. I set up several studies, and in those studies I defoliated a stand of blue bunch wheatgrass at 20, 40, 60, 80, and 100%. I also left one plot non-defoliated as the control, and I set these experiments up in stands of crested wheatgrass as well. Then I seeded each of the plots with diffuse snapweed. Not surprisingly, defoliation at 80% or greater produced more weeds than you could imagine. What was surprising was that some defoliation actually hindered weeds because it helped keep the plants from becoming old and wolfy. Grazing management should be geared towards keeping plants strong and healthy to maintain plant communities that can resist invasion by weeds. I have a few cows, so I'm trying to apply some cowboy logic to grazing weeds. Here's what seems to make sense to me. On the range, I see three major types of plants: grasses, forbs, and shrubs. It seems that if I graze animals that eat mainly grasses, I should expect an increase in forbs and shrubs. I know cattle like grasses. If I put out animals that like shrubs best, like goats, I can expect lots of grasses and forbs. And if I put out animals that like forbs best, like sheep, I can expect more grasses and shrubs. If I graze just the right number of all three classes of livestock, it seems like I can keep a balance with the types of forage on the range. Of course, if my cowboy logic tells me that I need sheep and goats in my operation, that can't be cowboy logic, can it? Well, I said I only had a few cows. In studies across the West, research has repeatedly shown that sheep, if used properly, will graze weeds in preference over grasses. Clearly, sheep are useful for managing leafy spurge, since the tender leaves and shoots are highly palatable to them. Sheep can also be useful for managing other weeds, but our studies suggest that the less palatable weeds require some conditioning before sheep actually prefer them over grasses. In one study, we sprayed weeds with 2,4-D. Some died and some died back to the crown. The new seedlings and fresh plant material emerging from the crowns were very luscious to the sheep. We kept the weeds from ever coming back by lightly grazing with sheep each spring. The grass production for cattle doubled. This week we've been talking about grazing and weeds. I'm often asked if high-intensity, short-duration grazing with cattle will control weeds. And in some cases, especially with winter annual grasses like cheatgrass or medusa head, high-intensity, short-duration grazing in the late fall and or the early spring for a few years in a row while our native plants are dormant can really lower the amount of these winter annual grasses. On the other hand, perennial broadleaf weeds are not as easily controlled using high-intensity, short-duration grazing. We tested the idea on spotted knapweed. We found that as grazing intensities are high enough to affect spotted knapweed, bare ground was increasing very rapidly. Once all the desired grasses were gone, the cattle ate the knapweed. Management that increases bare ground may not be a good idea, or at least will probably require some reseeding. I'm Roger Sheley. Thanks for listening, and have a great weekend.